of great sessions to offer. And I know Rachel is going to help me out here soon and share my slides so that we can be able to present those. In the meantime, I do want to make one clarification. So the Q&A function has been enabled for this meeting. At least I can see that on my end. And so if you have a question that you want to be included in the Q&A after the keynote, make sure that you put it in the Q&A section so that it's not getting lost among some of the other chats that we've had. I'll take a few minutes here to introduce myself. So my name is Jordan Davis, Jordan H. Davis. I use he, him pronouns, and I am a Black man with a beard, a white shirt, and dark skin. And as Rachel mentioned, I'm a faculty development specialist at Wilmington University, and I'm also a national speaker. So I travel all across the country and talk to faculty about their teaching and learning. And so I'm excited to be with you all today. Rachel, I don't know if you've stepped away or whether you are at your keyboard right now, but are you able to share the slides that I sent over? Are you able to share screen for us? Perfect. Awesome. Awesome. You can progress to the next slide whenever you're ready. Okay, so I wanted to outline two recommended modes of engagement before we get the party started. The first one is a social mode. So I know that on these large webinars or conference keynotes, there are some attendees that prefer to engage in real time in the chat. And so whether you have ideas or questions or resources to share in connection with what I'm talking about, you can use the chat to do that, right? And so the chat is one option, but then there are also some attendees that prefer a more low sensory experience, right? And so maybe you don't want to engage in the chat. You want to take things in slowly. You want to take notes on your personal time. And so I wanted to identify those two modes of engagement. Each of them are more than acceptable, and feel free to engage in the way that works best for you. And then Rachel, if you go to the next slide, you'll see that you can actually disable the chat, or at least mute the chat within a Teams call. And so if you look at the top bar of your screen, for most of you, you'll see three dots with the word more underneath. And then if you click that, and then go to settings, which should be one of the last options on that drop down menu, there will be a button that says mute notifications. And so as attendees start to engage throughout the session, as we're sharing ideas and resources, if you feel the need to, you can mute notifications there. And then you would use the same exact steps to unmute notifications if you change your mind at any point in the presentation. And I know Rachel and folks are in the room and can help out with any technical difficulties that we face during our time together. It looks like someone is requesting to make the screen a little bit larger. I think that might help me out too a little bit. So Rachel, I don't know if you're able to zoom in slightly without losing anything. This might be the best that we can do though, because if not, it might crop the slide itself. Looks like Rachel is troubleshooting for us there.
That a bit better?
That's fine for me, and it looks like Regina's asking for closed captions as well. So I'm not sure whether we can enable that. All right. Well, while you work
I'm working on the captions and moving them over to the screen that I'm sharing. That is something I'm working on.
Perfect. All right. No problem, Rachel. Thank you for your work on that. Then whenever you're ready, we can progress to the next slide. No rush. All right. And so in terms of the goals for this keynote, what are some of the things that I want you all to take away? There are really two main goals that I have. The first is to set technology policies for your courses that students feel intrinsically motivated to follow. When I mean technology policies, I mean expectations around generative AI use, around personal device use in the classroom, some of the big technology questions that a lot of us have going into this new semester. And then the second one is to promote academic integrity in ways that uphold rigor and student care. Because a lot of instructors see those two things as separate, but I feel like I make a compelling argument today that they actually work well in complementing each other, right? We can pursue both of those goals simultaneously. And in terms of how we're going to reach those goals today, the flow of the session, I'm going to start by defining pedagogies of care, by sharing some of the evidence around some of the care center teaching strategies that I want to share, navigating resistance. And so, what are some of the common points of faculty resistance to these strategies? How can we overcome them and reframe them? And then lastly, practical logistics for crafting course policies, not just for your students but alongside your students, actually inviting your students in to the expectation setting process. And before we dive into the content, before we get into the protein and potatoes of it, if everyone can make sure that their microphone is muted, just to make sure that there are no interferences there. So make sure you look at your screen, make sure you're muted before we dive into things. Thank you so much. Appreciate that. So a little bit about me, as I mentioned, faculty development specialist at Wilmington University. Wilmington is such a unique institution because 85% of their courses are offered in an online modality. And so constantly thinking about education technology within that capacity. I'm an adjunct instructor at Georgetown University, where I actually teach rising high school seniors in a special summer course on education technology. So I've had the opportunity to introduce students who are entering their senior year of high school to the field of education technology. And I'm constantly having critical conversations with them about the role of technology, specifically AI, in their learning. And then I'm a national speaker. I do this work often. If anything in this keynote is of interest to you or you think might be helpful for your instructors, there's my email at the bottom. That won't be the last time that you see this email, but I wanted to have it on the About Me slide. One more thing, too. Many of you should know I was born and raised in Baltimore County. I went to school at Randallstown High School, right across the street from BCCC. So anyone who is representing Baltimore County Community College, shout out to you. I'm representing you all today as well. So I thought that was a little fun tidbit there. All right, so here's where the chat comes in. So if you are using the chat today, I want you to use the chat to respond to this prompt. I want everyone here to describe a course policy or expectation that's foundational to the way that you teach. All right, so this can be about assignments, maybe it's about academic integrity, maybe it's your AI policy. Maybe it's the way that you care for students in the synchronous classroom, the way that you facilitate discussion. What is a policy or expectation that is foundational to the way you teach? I see David got us started with show your work, right? It's being organized, meeting one-on-one with students at least 5 minutes at some point during the course. I love that approach. You don't have to be perfect, but you have to work in this course. Appreciate that one as well. Verifying sources. Got a few comments on academic integrity here. Genuine work, verifying sources, yeah, being open-minded and respectful. That's a big one. I set community agreements with my students and I actually preview how I do that later in the keynote. And that's one of the big things that I communicate to them is the varying ways that students might define respect in the classroom and how we can align our expectations to make sure that we're all getting what we need. There's a student leader each week, so that's a unique approach to the classroom. Communication is big. And so these are some great ones. I love the thought generation here, getting really reflective about what we do well in our teaching. And as we finish up those thoughts and as those, continue to pile in, I want us to think about our second question. So Rachel, if you progress to the next slide, I have a follow-up question that I want people to weigh in on the chat. Yep, if you go back just one more, that'd be great. Yep, thank you. So if you could describe a course policy that you now strongly disagree with. So we started with a course policy that is foundational to our teaching, is a non-negotiable for us. Now let's think about course policies that we disagree with, whether it's something that you've experienced in your capacity as a former student or something that your colleague does in your class that you don't necessarily agree with. See several people putting mandatory attendance. That's one of the things that they disagree with, penalizing late work, giving grades for attendance. That seems to be a really popular one. Like ideas around showing up for class are really controversial in this room. Yeah. Requiring attendance. Students shouldn't feel guilty for not showing up to class. Looks like a math instructor weighed in with no graphing calculator. It's an interesting one to consider. Grades for attendance. So attendance is it seems to be like a unanimous disagree when it comes to attendance. Thank you all for thinking about that. I had us go through those two questions because without even thinking about it, you've begun to rationalize the teaching decisions that you either make and cherish in your course or you disagree with, right? In these rationales, there's values that undergird them, there's previous experience that undergirds them. Hopefully, there's evidence, teaching and learning evidence that undergirds them. And it's always nice to start the academic year being critical of how we approach students in the classroom and making sure that the policies and expectations that we set are actually evidence-based and student-centered. So thank you all for thinking about that. It actually segues into a story that I want to share from my teaching this past year. And so, Rachel, if you go to the next slide, you will see a very unsexy building at Georgetown University. This is the Intercultural Center, and this is where I teach my summer high school students in our education technology course. And every summer around mid-July, one of the first things that I do when I walk into the classroom is I organize the chairs in two rows where the chairs are facing each other, right? So think of two parallel rows, the chairs are facing each other. And I have my roughly about 15 to 20 students each summer, and I have them do what's called a speed friending activity. So instead of speed dating, it's speed friending. They spend anywhere between 1 to 3 minutes talking with their peers, and they rotate after the 3 minute mark. Right. And so it's a way for students to get to know each other at the very beginning of the class, to try to put names with faces from the outset. And it also allows me to learn about my students, aspects of their culture that they're proud of, technology oriented questions that they have going into the course. It's kind of a way of previewing some of the topics that we're going to cover in the course. And the activity takes anywhere between 30 to 45 minutes to get through these discussions, but I find it really helpful in sort of breaking the social ice in my classes. And so I did this on the first day this past summer. And the student that I'm talking to, directly across from me, our conversation dies down, but we pick up on that was called speed friending, Tisha. So the speed friending activity. And the person that I'm talking to, our conversation dies down, but we start to hear the students sitting immediately next to us. They start talking about generative AI. And so we get a little curious and we kindly ask to join their conversation. And so instead of having two pair conversations, we're now one little cluster of four at the far end of the classroom. And just as we're talking about AI, how their teachers approach it or what policies are actively implemented in their high school settings, I asked a question that I immediately regretted. Now, when I asked it, I didn't realize that it was problematic. But as soon as it left my lips, I could see that students were really uncomfortable by it. And all the question is, do you use AI in your learning? Just a curious question, right? Are you using AI in school? And immediately, the three other students that I was talking to, they immediately shut down. Like they start looking down. One of the girls, she like covers her mouth in embarrassment. And it made me realize that students have so many textured experiences when it comes to technology. And I'm fortunate to have been in a classroom. At the time, I was a master's degree student when ChatGPT first came out in 2022, really burst on the scene, where AI was accepted. Like it was celebrated that we were really some of the first students in the country at Georgetown University's Learning Design and Technology program to engage with this technology and critically analyze it. And I was so in my teacher expert, super excited about technology brain that I didn't think about the student well-being lens that kind of undergirds a lot of students' perceptions around generative AI. Later into this class, so a few class sessions later, I engaged my students in a conversation about Gen AI. We did some activities around it, and I learned really the trauma that a lot of those students had experienced. I know one student had never even seen how a chat bot worked. You would think that at some point on TikTok or YouTube, they would see a chat bot. They had never seen a chat bot, let alone engage with one themselves. There was another student in that class who's one of their close friends, one of their close friends in their high school class, got reamed by their instructor, like yelled at in front of the entire class for being accused of misusing AI on an assignment. And so students are coming into my classroom with such varied experiences, a lot of them problematic experiences. And this was one of the first times where I really had to think about how to create an inclusive learning environment that was centered in care while also preparing students for the future, right? Not just their future as learners, but the future of whatever professional field they're going to go into. One of my goals as an educator was to equip them with technology oriented skills. And Rachel, if you go to the next slide, you'll realize that K through 12 isn't the only space in education that is fraught with AI and academic integrity challenges. When I look at some of the major headlines from last year in 2025, and I'll read some of these examples for you too on the screen. Quote, a death penalty. PhD student says University of Minnesota expelled him over unfair AI allegation. Another story, she lost her scholarship over an AI allegation and it impacted her mental health. A University of Buffalo student called for an end to an AI software that some faculty use to detect the accuracy of their work. And then this New York Times piece on the left-hand side, where the headline reads, quote, a new headache for honest students, proving they didn't use AI, literally profiling students who felt the need to set up a tripod and a camera, whether it be their phone or an actual camera, in the corner of the room while they completed work. They would have these 4 and 5 hour videos on their phone as insurance, just in case an instructor accused them of using AI to complete an assignment. They could say, I have video proof that I sat for 4 hours and I worked on this thing. And these headlines are disparaging. These are not examples of caring for students. And when I look at these headlines, when I think about what my students were telling me last summer, I realized that there are so many challenges when it comes to managing technology in the classroom and all the different opinions and viewpoints and policies that students are expected to internalize. And so it leads me to this question, this long preamble of me doing narrative storytelling. It gets me to this one question, and Rachel, you can reveal the question on the next slide. How can we set expectations with and not for our students when it comes to the role of technology in learning? And what I've realized over the years in talking to students about technology is that they have strong opinions. They have a lot of expertise, sometimes more than the expertise that we have as instructors. And so, what does it look like to bring them into the conversation about expectations? I see time and time again, instructors will have an AI policy in their syllabus, but that policy is one sentence. And that one sentence is AI is not allowed under any circumstances in this course. And you just think about all of the learning loss that comes with such a policy and how it robs students of their agency and autonomy to contribute to the expectations of their learning environment. And so if I can communicate anything to you today, it will be to critically address this question. How can we set expectations alongside our students that maintains the rigor of our courses? Many of you articulated that genuine hard work is something that you value, while also caring for students' well-being and making sure that they feel included and represented in the learning environments that we're creating. You can go to the next slide, Rachel. And so I've talked in bits and pieces about pedagogies of care. That's in the title of this keynote, pedagogies of care for the future of learning. But what is a pedagogy of care? Folks at Duke University's Center for Teaching and Learning talked about pedagogy of care or a pedagogy of care as a set of intentional course design choices that prioritizes student well-being, access, and inclusion. And when those things are prioritized together, that counts as a pedagogy of care. And on the next slide, I share a few examples of pedagogies of care. And Rachel, if you don't mind, progressing there. But before we get there, the why it matters is important too. I wanted to show some evidence around it. These are important because higher ed has been historically exclusionary. I did some recent reading on how in the 1950s, the University of Texas at Austin was one of the first higher ed institutions in the country to implement standardized testing to delay desegregation, right? They were preventing Black and historically marginalized students from matriculating into their university through the use of standardized testing. And all throughout the history of higher ed in the U.S., there's been examples of exclusion along the lines of race, gender, ability, etc. And even some of the traditions that are associated with higher ed. So you think about bell curved grading and expensive course materials and canonized authors within particular discipline. All of these examples uphold exclusion within higher ed. And then when we look at the opposite of that, when well-being is prioritized in teaching and learning, when we give students access to learning, and when we cultivate a sense of belonging among students, all those things have been shown to be positively correlated with academic success. And so when we talk about pedagogies of care, it's not just something that's for K through 12 educators, or it's not this, unnecessary need to cater to students. No, students need this in order to be successful. And there are ways that we can do that that I hope to talk about today in this keynote. And so here you see on the screen some examples of pedagogies of care, things like low stakes assessments, things like generous resubmission policies. I saw a few of you all comment about that in the chat. Actually feeding students. So bringing snacks to class. If your students are showing up hungry, or if you know that they're missing dinner because they're coming straight from work, whatever it may be, actually giving students the nutritional sustenance that they need. Pre-course surveys, learning about your students before day one, so that on the first day of class, you've already started to design the learning experience in alignment with what your students need. And then even things like vulnerable teaching, sharing your struggles as a former student and as a current professional. It looks like someone might be unmuted. If we could just mute, that would be great. Here's some background noise there.
I do not let my house.
If I could have some help getting this person muted. Okay, awesome. Thank you. No penalties for late work. You all mentioned that in the chat too. Breaks during instruction, and then establishing community agreements to make sure that when students engage with each other in the classroom, their conversations, how they treat each other is in alignment with mutual respect along all lines. And so it sounds like a lot of you all are already implementing pedagogies of care, but I wanted to bring into focus just a few of the examples, and there are so many more that aren't covered in this slide. And if you go to the next one, I wanted to demonstrate an example of how pedagogies of care can actually lead us to better navigate the future of learning. So when I showed those headlines from the news stories from 2025, those are poor examples of how instructors are navigating the future of learning. But when we think about the strategies that you just saw on the last slide, and how they might help us towards some of the technology that we don't even see yet, that's really on the horizon, there's really a lot of evidence to support them. And I wanted to show this graph here. This is from a survey that was conducted at the very beginning of this academic year. In August of 2025 is when this report came out. It's conducted by Inside Higher Ed. About 1,000 students, both from 2-year and 4-year institutions from all across the country, about 100 or so universities represented. And they asked students, what were the top 2 reasons that you think your peers are misusing AI? What are the top 2 reasons that students are using AI to cheat in their learning? And the top 3 answers, which are unsurprising to me, were 1, pressure to get good grades, 2, lack of time due to work, family, or other obligations. I know that's something that's really prevalent among community college students that might have, be juggling multiple responsibilities. And then the third most populous answer, students not really caring about academic integrity policies, that those are usually set at the university level. It's on some website somewhere, but they don't realize the importance of it immediately in the classes that they're actively taking. And Rachel, if you go to the next slide, we talk about how pedagogies of care can actually mitigate some of the technology oriented challenges that we're facing in our courses. And I think this slide is so important because often In education, when we talk about AI and other technologies, we like to throw tools at the problem. We like to throw, terms like prompt generation, right? Technical skills that we might equip our students with. And then, of course, the rules and policies that kind of govern the use of technology. But what does it look like to throw care at the problem, right? Like students need love and support right now. And we can do this in an evidence-based way. For example, we can scaffold assignments to reduce academic pressure, right? And so instead of having 3 big papers that students had to complete over the course of the semester and the stakes of that assignment causing students to procrastinate or to not ask for help because there's a lot of anxiety around those assignments, how can we reduce the academic pressure of those assignments and break them into smaller chunks so that one, we could be able to intervene as students make progress toward those larger assignments. If they do them in smaller steps, we can supervise the process. The students themselves can reflect on their assignment completion process. And the big thing is that it alleviates some of the stress and anxiety that students feel. We talk about things like implementing flexible assignment deadlines. Those have been shown to lower the value of cheating in time-pressured situations. Obviously, we want our students to always be submitting things on time, right? But life happens. A lot of our students don't have fully formed brains if they're in their teenage years or early 20s. And so mistakes are bound to happen. And what are the supports that we have in our classroom to help our students through those mistakes? And one of the things that I try to remember is that if a student is late on an assignment, they're already behind the 8 ball, right? They already need support. They're already not caught up with their peers. They might have to sacrifice time studying and completing current assignments to catch up on past ones. And so I don't want to penalize a student for already being behind, right? So what can I do as an educator to help them get up to speed and to make sure that when it's Sunday night and it's 11:30 p.m. and the student is still working on their assignment, is my late penalty going to push them to do something that's unethical? Is my late penalty, the negative 10%, the negative 20%, is it going to drive them to do something that they normally wouldn't have done if that penalty weren't in place? So maybe they submit a day later or 2 days later, but the quality of the assignment is better and they did it ethically because that penalty isn't in there, right? So just some things to think about. And then even co-creating ethical standards with our students can help them buy into academic integrity policies. I have a book with me. It's called The Opposite of Cheating. I've got my virtual background on, so you can't see it, but it's by Tricia Gallant and David Redinger. And that's given me a lot of helpful tools for talking about academic integrity with students. And if you actually co-create ethical standards within your courses, so not just copying and pasting the university policy into your syllabus, but actually talking to students about what does it look like to actually uphold this policy in the classroom, that's really important for students as well. But even in the face of all the evidence and citations from the last slide, um, Tisha, those examples are coming in just a moment. Stay with us. There are some points of resistance that often come up to this, right? And so when I talk to faculty about it, they'll say things like adult learners don't need care-centered teaching, right? And Larson supports this in her literature review of a care and teaching. Almost all of it is K through 12 literature, right? Because working with juvenile students, there's this assumption that adult learners don't need care. There's also the assumption of I'm not a counselor, right? This isn't my job. That I'm gonna leave that to the mental health counselors on campus. But if well-being has a direct connection to how students are performing and showing up in your course, and there are evidence-based strategies that you can use as an instructor to allow students to feel well, it's almost negligent to not use those strategies in your classroom, right? So trying to absolve ourselves of the responsibility isn't necessarily helpful either. If we go to the next slide, there are some more common points of resistance. It doesn't prepare students for the real world, which is code for, being kinder to students or giving students leniency doesn't align with the late stage capitalism that they're going to go to work in, right? The relentless pace of work that I'm trying to prepare my students for. But there's a pernicious assumption there, and that's creating the assumption is that creating harsh work environments in our classrooms is preparing students to face those harsh environments outside of the classroom. What I try to tell instructors is that just because you have students go through that in your class doesn't mean that you're actually preparing them to navigate to cope with the pressures of the assignments. All you're doing is just showing them what the consequences are, right? And so unless we actually give our students tools to be more successful in managing their time and managing their work plate, realizing that they're learning skills in our courses for the very first time, and we shouldn't try to compare them to someone that's a professional that's been working 15 years, that's a specialist in a particular skill. Our students are learners first and foremost. And so how can we make sure that our courses are conducive to learning? And then obviously the myth of, students need and want structure, which is actually true, but they want it in combination with flexibility, right? So they appreciate structure with flexibility infused into it. It's not just one or the other. And so, with these common points of resistance, there's even one more common point of resistance that isn't on this slide, and that's time and energy, right? So caring for students is time intensive, it's energy intensive, it's a labor of love, as some might say. And what I've seen instructors point to is the fact that we need to hold our tech companies accountable, the ones that are creating the generative AI platforms, the ones that are creating AI agents, right? These browsers that can complete tasks on behalf of the student. What are the restrictions that they can put into place? And I absolutely agree with that. But at the same time, in the meantime, like while those policies are hopefully being formed and a lot of educators are kind of rallying around those causes, there are things that we can do right now in our classrooms to serve students well. So we shouldn't wait for the tech companies to solve those problems. There are things that we can do right now. All right, so the moment we've all been waiting for, how to actually set course policies with and not for your students. If you go to the next slide, there are two distinct approaches to this that I try to outline. You can either generate a course policy and then get your students' input on it, or you can have students draft the policy in small groups and then you talk about it as a class, and then you can, on the back end as the instructor, fine tune that policy, make adjustments to it to make it fit your teaching philosophy. So I'm going to talk through some examples of these two. If you go to the next slide. This is an example of a personal device policy. It's kind of long, but I wanted to give you all an example of what you might actually see in a syllabus when it comes to expectations around smartphone use and even the use of laptops and tablets in a classroom. And so I'm going to take a few moments to read this. This class will involve a mixture of lecture, learning activities, and discussion. To promote a culture of deep engagement with your classmates and course content, cell phones are expected to be silent and away during class. You may use laptops, tablets, and digital note-taking devices during lectures and group work, and there will be a designated break in the middle of each class where you can use your phone. Recent evidence shows that even the most disciplined students experience decreases in learning and knowledge retention when distracted by their phones. And my hope is to make my class accessible while maximizing your learning. I'm more than happy to loosen these restrictions for students who have university approved accommodations. Now, this isn't my exact personal device policy, but this is an example of everything that a course policy needs to include. It needs to include your goals for this policy, how it connects to your broader teaching philosophy, how it's student-centered, to how it's actually going to benefit your students. That's why I included the evidence link in there. And then particulars around the logistics, right? Like making the distinction between when students should be expected to use their phones versus when they should be expected to use other devices too. And if you go to the next slide, you can use a policy like this. Show it to your students, what would it look like to actually print out your syllabus or to print out this policy, and then have students discuss this prompt in small groups. How do you think this policy will help or hinder your learning? And how does this approach compare to expectations in your other courses? And this can really get students thinking about, okay, how does this work for me? Right? And then what are some of my other instructors doing that can either inform this policy and make it better, or can be warning signs for how this policy might detract from my learning. One of the favorite things that I do with my students is that I showed them some of the expectations that I have in my course, and I had them do a 3 to 5 minute free write with just them on their own. And then I have them break out into small groups and they can talk about it with their classmates. And then we come together as a whole, right? So it's a fully scaffolded activity. And this doesn't take any more than, 20, 25 minutes. You can have students spend a few minutes to themselves, a few minutes in groups, and then talk about it as a whole. And then after the class is over, after the 20 to 25-minute activity, you can take that policy, fine tune it, and then add it to your syllabus to make sure that students are well represented in the policy. These are great questions in the chat too. Keep them coming. I'm starting to see them, pop up every now and again, and I try to tackle them as they come in. If you don't mind going to the next slide. All right, and then this is an example. I wanted to show an example of student-generated policies with faculty input, right? And so what if you want the students themselves to be the authors of your course expectations, and then you can then come in on the back end and edit them, right? And so if you go to the next slide, I use the example of an AI policy, specifically the use cases section of an AI policy. Students determining, when is it okay to use certain generative AI platforms and what does that use look like? These are some reflective prompts that I use with my students and I find really helpful. Which uses of generative AI have helped your learning the most as a student? And I really get them to think about the learning piece of that statement, because using AI to complete an assignment isn't necessarily the same as using AI for their learning. And when they anchor their response in the learning, what actually helps me understand the material, then they develop some really rich use case examples that I could try to promote in my classes. And then reflection prompt number 2, you can go back if you don't mind, Rachel. Which uses of generative AI pose threats to academic integrity and ethical principles? So students can come up with the positive use cases, but it's sometimes just as helpful for them to come up with the negative use cases, the things that they see other students do, or even regrettably they've done themselves that don't align with academic integrity principles. And then lastly, the reflective prompt number 3, name examples of ways that I myself as an instructor can promote honesty, trust, and fairness in my teaching. So I'm getting students feedback on what I can do to make sure that everyone is trying to support each other in the learning environment. I'm not putting the sole weight on the students to make decisions over their learning. And I heard someone ask in the chat, I think they asked about what discipline I teach in. This is a education technology course for rising high school seniors. So if my 16 and 17-year-olds are capable with doing this kind of work, then I know the college level students, some of you might even be teaching high school students at the community college level, they're more than capable of doing this too. And Rachel, if you go to the next slide, I wanted to prove this, right? Because I almost stumbled into this practice. Last summer, as a part of the course, this assignment is in my syllabus, I have students join pairs, so they have a partner, and I asked them to become TAs for a future college course. And they are in charge with determining the subject that they want to co-teach, and they're also in charge of determining the AI policy as TAs for that course. And so 2 students chose to teach a social studies 101 course at the college level, and they were able to list some pretty robust, acceptable and unacceptable use cases when it came to generative AI. And so I wanted to show this example because students are more than capable of this, and this was just one section of a larger AI policy. And again, it doesn't have to take longer than 20 minutes or so to be able to set expectations with your students. And you also don't have to expect to use this for every single course policy you have. You might choose one that you feel like is really important for students. Maybe it's your assignment submission policy. You want to ask students, what approaches to assignment submission have worked well for you in previous learning environments? How can we bring those same principles into the class? Maybe it's the personal device thing, right? Maybe you struggle with students using their phones during class and being distracted. We can choose conversations that are helpful for us in terms of like some of the challenging areas that we currently face in our teaching. And just briefly, why these collaborative policies work. Well, first, they prioritize student agency. And so Flanagan and colleagues, along with Ryan and Dichi, pros that digital distraction can arise when students' basic psychological needs for autonomy, competence, or relatedness are unsatisfied in college classrooms. So instructors think that a top-down strict policy when it comes to phone or AI is going to work for students, was robbing students of their agency, which is foundational to their psychological well-being. And it makes them less likely to follow the policy as opposed to ones that they set themselves, they identify with themselves. And then there's a clarity piece too. I found this fascinating in the book, The Opposite of Cheating, that I mentioned a few moments ago. McCabe and colleagues found that just 37% of students thought that collaborating on assignments designed to be completed individually was an academic integrity violation. But when they asked the instructors the same question, 84% of faculty thought it was a violation. So there's a huge discrepancy in what students view as fair and an alignment with academic integrity and what instructors think is fair and academically rigorous. And so there needs to be a conversation to make sure that the expectations of the student match those of their instructors. And so when I share out this slide deck, you'll have access to an AI, a sample AI policy that I like to share with the faculty that I work with. And these are just some of the components of it, acceptable use cases, addressing AI agents, which have burst on the scene in the past couple of months. Teaching students how to cite generative AI is a huge win when it comes to academic integrity and supporting them around that. Instructor use of AI tools. So if you're using AI in your teaching, how can you model the honesty and transparency by sharing with students how you're using generative AI, and so many other different facets to consider. And this sample policy, it's about 2 pages long, but I feel like it's necessary for just how disruptive this technology is and to make sure that students are well supported. Because one of the things that I do in my syllabus, I try not to view my syllabus as a set of rules, but instead a learning resource that students can go back to time and time again to make sure that they're getting the support that they need. As mentioned earlier, you can use this model to establish AI policies, assignment policies, academic integrity standards with students, or phone and personal device policies. All of these are examples of, how to promote care with your students while preparing them for the future of learning. You can go to the next slide. In terms of next steps, is the grand finale here. I want to challenge you to identify one aspect of your teaching to discuss or co-design with your students. And this is an on-the-fly thing, and I see the chat is popping off right now. I love it. If folks could share the area of teaching where they think collaborative course policies might be helpful for. So is it your assignment policies? Is it your grading policies? Is it your AI policy? Where in your teaching do you think this could be most helpful? Feel free to drop that in the chat so we can see some of those responses come in. And then lastly, which is equally important, decrease the value of cheating by eliminating punishments from your teaching. The only punishment should be not learning in your courses. You can go to the next slide here. All right, and so with that, I actually want to take a quick pause before we get into the Q&A. Rachel, if you don't mind just audibly telling us how much time I have left so I could be able to, manage that well.
Based on the technical issues and us getting started late, you've got roughly 7 minutes.
Okay, great. I want us to take time to complete this feedback survey, and then I want to do like a rapid fire Q&A. If you have a question, please put it in the Q&A section. So there should be a little Q&A feature at the top bar. Please complete the survey first, and then after that, a few minutes, maybe at 11:31, we can come back together and try to answer a question or two before our time is up. So.
And Jordan, there was a question in the chat regarding this sounding kind of like a fluid syllabus. Do you mind addressing that?
Yeah, I've never heard of a fluid syllabus. I think it's an apt analogy, though. I have heard of a live syllabus. And so all throughout grad school, all of our instructors in our program, they would have their syllabus as a Google Doc. And that doc was consistently updated, making changes to assignment deadlines, to even adding assignments midway through the course. And so I definitely think it aligns with, flexible teaching strategies more generally. And as the biggest part for me is allowing students into my syllabus, allowing students to add things to my syllabus. And so you can have a consistently updated syllabus, but you're the sole one that's updating it. I prefer a syllabus to where students get to be involved in actually setting some of the expectations in the learning environment. So, and as people are completing that survey, maybe we could hit another question. Rachel, do you see another question either in the
Okay,
Q&A
so
bubble or the chat?
actually, it's not under the Q&A, but there is another
Yeah.
question in the chat about how it works in terms of quote unquote, they cheat and we give them full credit anyway. I'm not sure what that's going to look like.
I'm not sure what that looks like either because I've never heard of that, right? And so I think there are clear violations of academic integrity that are protected by our university policies, right? And so any situation where students are copying and pasting outputs of generative AI, we know that's a violation of academic integrity. Even when students fail to give credit for work that comes from AI, that's the same thing as, human created work, right? You would never take another human's work and use it without giving them credit. And those should follow the university academic integrity policies, right? So we still need to keep those in perspective. But I think what that instructor is speaking to is sort of this gray area to where if students complete an assignment, and you allow them to use generative AI, for example, you're not banning it in your courses, but it still sounds a little bit AI generated. Like, what do you do in those scenarios? I think one place is to really refine our rubrics to make sure that our rubrics are in alignment with our learning outcomes and clearly articulates those, right? Because in the types of assignments that I have, if the assignment reads like it's generative AI drafted, it's probably C or D level work, right? Because it doesn't have the nuance, the lived experience, the stakeholder perspectives that I require in my assignments that ChatGPT isn't the greatest at replicating. And I think the other approach is to actually assess, like intentionally assess students' AI literacy. And so having students, almost requiring students to use AI in their learning and assessing them on their processes in terms of the prompts that they use, even having students upload chat history to Canvas or whatever our learning management system is and getting graded on that. And so those are the two main approaches, right? I think we can grade student work honestly and give them earnest feedback about how their work presents to us, or we can intentionally design AI competencies into the curriculum so that students are actually being assessed by how well they use AI or not. So,
Okay, so we just have a question in the Q&A. How
yeah.
do you encourage students to contribute to community agreements or giving input on policies? This faculty goes on to say, I've been met with silence when I ask for input.
Yes, I love this question. Thank you for asking it. Setting community agreements is one of my favorite things to do with students. And I usually ask them two questions. So I ask them, think about a productive class discussion that you've been a part of. What about that learning environment made that discussion productive? So that's the first question. And then I ask them the opposite. Think about a poor class discussion that you've been a part of. What about that learning environment made the discussion unproductive? And I feel like that does a few things for students. It gets them reflecting on how they show up in discussions and how they want their classmates to show up in discussions. And then it also, when I ask about like the best versus worst, students can literally think about conversations where they felt silenced or one person dominated the conversation and they couldn't get a word in, right? Like they start to name these specific examples. And when I have them free write about this and then share out as a group, I'm at the front of the board and I've got my bullet points, and usually comes out to about 10 to 15 different bullet points of things that students name that either worked or didn't work in those discussions. And then that sort of becomes the de facto community agreements. And so I think scaffolding the activity instead of just asking it out loud and then waiting for students to speak up breaking it down so that students are free writing about it first. They can sit with their thoughts, sit with their ideas, and then even break it down even further to share it with a person next to them before they bring it to the whole group. That can really spark discussion in a positive way. So.
Okay, so we have another question, and we've got about one more minute. How do you negotiate situations where students abuse flexibility with deadlines and it becomes habitual? In other words, I'm quick to grant an extension for a student, but I would be concerned that when they start co-writing course policies, it sends a message that classroom management strategies are negotiable.
Great question. I think of two research studies. There was one Canadian study involving about 40 students, and the 40 students in this undergraduate level biology course, they had 301 opportunities to ask for assignment extensions. And so in this particular course, there were unlimited assignment extensions, and they counted how many times students actually used that extension policy. They only used it 18% of the 301 um you know possibilities that they could have used that assignment extension. And it makes me think about the assumptions that we have when it comes to flexible teaching of like, if we loosen up our classroom, students are going to take advantage of it, where the data doesn't really bear that out. And I think we can handle that on a case by case basis without punishing the students that are actually using it for legitimate reasons that can really benefit from it. And then another study too is just, it's related to the idea of assignment deadlines in general. You had about 230 psychology students. All of these students were in taking an online psychology course, and they had an unlimited grace period on assignments. So students were allowed to submit assignments at any point past the deadline. So if the deadline was today, January 8th, I could submit it in February and still get credit for it. They found that the students that chronically submitted their work late performed just as well on the midterm and the final exam as the students who submitted all of their assignments on time. And so it goes to show that a lot of the deadlines that we set for our assignments are sort of arbitrary anyway in terms of actually preparing students. And the ones that really do matter, we can communicate to students that they matter. And in connection to that last slide that I just showed, the only punishment in my courses is the learning. So students know if they miss a deadline, they won't be able to fully engage in the discussions with their classmates the next week. They might be behind because the information builds on each other each week. And students know that going in. And so those two studies of realizing that assignment deadlines are usually arbitrary and students can participate in setting them and understanding the importance of them, and just realizing too that students aren't abusing these policies in the way that a lot of faculty fear that they're going to is really helpful. So.
Well, thank you very much, Jordan, for joining us this morning. Thank you everyone for staying these last several minutes to help us offset the tech issues we had at the beginning. We are now going to go off to lunch. Our next session starts at 1 o'clock. If you want to reach out to Jordan, he does have his contact info on one of the earlier slides. This presentation will be posted on the AFFACT AFFACT site. So enjoy your lunch, everyone.
Can I say one thing, Rachel, for those who are still
absolutely.
on?
Go ahead.
If you complete the survey, you can insert your email into that survey. I'm going to email everyone the slides after, so make sure that you get to that survey. Rachel, I don't know if you want to leave it up for like another minute or two for folks who didn't catch it the first time.
Oh, sure.
Make sure that you complete the survey. I'm going to put my email in the chat as well for those who want to copy that. So jordan@jdspeaks.com. That is my email. And yes, please reach out to me with any questions. I appreciate your energy and your engagement here. So thanks, everybody.